welcome back, everyone. I think we'll get down to it. I'm very pleased. Some of you probably met John Harfouch a little bit yesterday because he joined for our discussion. John was actually a participant in the workshop last year, and so his presence here is a manifestation of one of the ways in which we'd really like the workshop to function, and that is in terms of a kind of communal ethos where people build up their own work, but in dialogue with others, and there's a kind of transnational community formation that's going on. His work, correct me if any of this is incorrect, but John's work that I know of is on the history of philosophy, particularly looking at the category of race from kind of Descartes to Kant was one of his main book projects, and focusing on the mind-body problem, so also spanning kind of continental debates, history of philosophy debates, analytic debates, etc. And he's a specialist on the critical philosophy of race, and so has worked extensively on these debates within the Anglophone context, but also much more broadly. He launched last year which might continue, a society that is focused on Middle Eastern and North African thought in order to foreground the importance of these traditions. And the work that he's going to share with us today is related to kind of two different positions on, well, not only different, there's a lot of complementarity as well, but on the question of violence. And so in discussing the best way to kind of integrate with what we've been doing thus far, John has some prepared comments to kind of set the stage for the relationship between Phenom and Hezbollah. And then we'll have a very general conversation and discussion around a lot of the issues that he raises. So with no further ado, oh, and I forgot to mention perhaps at least the most important level of protocol. John is a professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where he teaches in the philosophy department. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks. Obviously, thanks to Gabriel. Thanks for this whole platform. It's great to have this kind of thing. And obviously, it's great to be in Paris in the summer. So I'll just get right into it. There were two readings for today. And I'm going to kind of talk around them, and then we can get into them later if you all want to. First reading was 2009 manifesto from Hezbollah. It's from this book, Hezbollah's Documents, edited by Joseph Alaga. That manifesto is authored by Sayed Hassan Nasrallah. Nasrallah is the Secretary General of Hezbollah. It's their new manifesto. Their first manifesto was called An Open Letter to the Oppressed of the World, and that was from 1985. They're similar in certain ways. There's some differences. If you want to talk about that, we can talk about that later, but it's not crucial to today's talk. But in any case, it's sort of an updated manifesto. The second reading was from Franz Phenom, a short essay called Why We Use Violence. It appears in the French version of a book that's in English is called The Dying Colonialism as an appendix to that book, but for whatever reason it doesn't make it into the English translation. But thankfully we have this new compilation of more or less obscure Phenom writings, both in French and in English now, and it appears in that book. So in any case, just a little bit of context. It's as you saw, right, it's apparent from the reading, it's a speech that he gave in 1960 in Accra. So in any case, first of all, I just want to give you like some real general background to talk about Hezbollah, what they're doing, who they are, what their motives are, what they're responding to. The other thing that I want to talk about is who Phenom was, what he was responding to in Algeria in the 1950s and 60s, early 60s, and help you kind of see how these two thinkers, Nasrallah and Phenom, are incredibly similar. But one group is really kind of a third rail in the academy, whereas in the case of Phenom, he's kind of like a celebrated figure at the moment. I'm not sure if you all are seeing this in your classes or in your or conferences that you go to, but you can hardly go anywhere without somebody referencing Phenom. It's Phenom everywhere. Some of you are nodding, so that's you're all experiencing this. Okay. Like I'll just say, when I was in grad school 15 years ago, not totally the case, and I went to a grad school that's like promoting this kind of stuff. So it's really been interesting to see this change. And as we'll see, I'm really interested in how this guy in Algeria who advocated and defended Arab terrorists, in effect, killing French civilians, how this guy has gained so much traction in the academy, where from a Middle Eastern person's standpoint, this is not the norm when Arab people kill civilians. So in any case, that's kind of where I want to go. So in any case, let's just talk a little bit about Hezbollah. I don't know how much you know about this organization, so I'm sorry if this is like real basic, okay? But let's just kind of nail down some of the ABCs. Hezbollah is Arabic for the party of God. That's what Hezbollah means. It's a Lebanese political party. Now, of course, in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, in France, it's a terrorist group. They all, among other countries, mark it as a terrorist group. You read about this a little bit in the manifesto, how Hezbollah understands this word terrorism. However, Lebanon is more or less a democracy. And just for example, right, from the last election that happened just a couple of years ago, Hezbollah gets 20% of the popular vote. If you include, like, this isn't a two-party system where the other party is getting 80% of the vote. I mean, this is like 20% of the vote is significant for those of us in an American context. If you include the parties, though, that kind of align with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah gets something kind of like 50% of the vote. So they're a very popular political party in Lebanon. So you don't want to confuse them with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever. I know that Pompeo or Trump or even Obama talks about these groups all in the same breath, but that's just really inaccurate. They're a political party. They're an elected political party. Now, of course, they didn't really start that way. They started as a grassroots militia in the early 1980s, protecting their land from an invasion. But nowadays they have a weekly newspaper, they have a TV station, they have a building corporation like a construction company. They do trash pickup, they're involved in education, they have hospitals. They're similar in certain ways to the Panthers in the United States, in the US. But they have an Islamic, and really at the end of the day, we can talk about this later on, they really have a Shia ideological backbone. We can get into that later on. So in any case, because in the manifesto and really throughout Hezbollah's writings, Israel is such a basic theme, we need to talk a little bit about what Israel is, at least from Hezbollah's standpoint, and perhaps really from a Lebanese standpoint. Now, Lebanon is invented as a French colony in 1917 with Sykes-Picot agreement. Now, all these Arab countries that you know and love, right? They're all invented at that time as well: Syria, Iraq, etc. Now, I'm sorry if you know this, but I'm just going to go through this really quickly. All right. British Mandate Palestine, also invented around that same time through the Balfour Declaration in 1919. That, if you studied the Balfour Declaration at all, it was in a way, not in a way, it was an anti-Semitic project. The Balfour Declaration was an anti-Semitic project. Britain, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, thought that they had got a raw deal with France, that France had got too much strategic territory. So that was one of their concerns. On the other hand, Britain had what they considered at the time, right, in the teens, a quote-unquote Jewish problem in Britain. like there are too many powerful Jews in Britain. What are they doing with our banking system? How are they influencing our culture? What are we going to do with these people? You probably know, right? They considered basically sending them or allowing them to go to Uganda, but they didn't want that. Theodor Herzl, the guy who in a way really founded the Zionist movement, wanted to go to Palestine for historical reasons. And so in any case, the Balfour Declaration declares or designates a quote-unquote national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, right, starting in 1920. That's a key date that you really have to remember. If you want to read more about that, the Balfour Declaration is really key context of this whole thing. I can send you literature, or there's even like a good short movie on it. It's easy to learn about. A couple other key dates you need from Palestinian history. First, there's the Nakba in 1948. In the wake of the Holocaust, David Ben-Gurion enacts his plan called Plan D to ethnically cleanse Palestine of most of its Arab population. Now, again, this is really, I say, kind of an Arab perspective on this region's history. When I say ethnically cleanse, though, that's the words. Those are the words of Ilan Pappé, a famous Jewish scholar, wrote a pretty important book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I really recommend you read it if you want to know some of the ABCs about this region. I'll leave it at that. We can go into those details if you want to debate that in any case. The other date to keep in mind is 1967. All right, and I'm going through this incredibly briefly because I don't want to bore everybody to death. But 1967, Israel has more or less established itself as a state. In 1967, it fights a series of wars with neighboring Arab countries and expands its territory significantly, okay? And that's a very short story on how Israel basically came to be. Now, I want to give you a couple things about what happens in the interim between 1948 and 1967, because it's not like just nothing happens. A lot happens in Palestine between 1948 and 1967. To make a long story short, Israel goes from being effectively a British colony to themselves becoming the colonizers. And this happens through basically a wholesale transferal of the British colonial legal system into Zionist laws. Okay, so Zionists in Israel basically just adopt the British colonial legal system, the same legal system that was in place in South Africa and other places around the world, as Britain starts to withdraw from its colonies. So, critically though, in the 1940s, around the Nakba, the Israeli parliament adopts what Britain called its defense emergency regulations, okay, these DERs. Now the DERs were part of the British legal system where in the colonies, Britain would delegate sovereignty to the military and within a specified territory, and would authorize its commanders to suspend all basic constitutional liberties, including property and habeas corpus rights. And Israel adopts this from the outset, right? It declares these, basically declares these states of emergencies in certain regions. And it allows them to push people off of the land and basically do anything they want in a state of emergency. The two things that they do that's really most significant to help you kind of understand how Palestine has come to look the way it does, regional magistrates in these require anyone moving within those zones to have a permit, right? Moving within those zones and between those zones, you must have a permit. And they impose strict curfews. And so Palestinians then live under this kind of aggressive curfew and permit system. So travel is impossible, basically, and even the most basic offenses would be persecuted through these really basically unpayable fines. And so even back in the 1940s, what some people today call a kind of open-air prison is starting to take shape in Palestine. At the same time, Israel decides that all the areas from which the Palestinians had fled after the Nakba is quote-unquote fallow land. And the Fallow Lands Act allowed Zionist settlers to basically just take the land, since purportedly nobody occupies it. And this is all the Fallow Lands Act is all very similar to what the United States did with Native American lands some centuries ago. We'll come back to that because Hezbollah is very cognizant of that aspect of American history. And Hezbollah is very, very interested in how the use of violence and the archiving of that violence, the remembrance of that violence, creates a kind of history of the land that thwarts this narrative that nobody occupies it. We'll get to that later on. Now, of course, Lebanon, which is just across the border, is watching what's happening in Palestine, and as a French colony, they suspect something similar is going to happen in Lebanon. Now, Israel has invaded and occupied Lebanon 3 different times. Once in 1978, once in 1982, and most recently in 2006. Now, Hezbollah is born from that 1980 occupation, right? The occupation in 1982. Certainly, it doesn't happen all at once. You probably look to a kind of political transformation in the Islamic community in the 1960s, if you really wanted to kind of go back and see the origins of this development. But if you wanted to mark one date that is probably crucial for Hezbollah's development, it would be Sabra and Shatila in September of 1982, where American and Israeli military forces encircled a Palestinian camp and slaughtered everybody. One of the most brutal episodes in Lebanese history. However, right, in 1982, Israel basically occupies half of Lebanon and a lot of Beirut. The only resistance Israel really meets in that occupation is from the Shia community in the slums of South Lebanon. And those people, that community, that will form itself into a political party and become what is known today as Hezbollah. That is Hezbollahs Origins. So it is a anti-colonial movement in the very strict sense of the word. I know that these words now get used all the time, but it is an anti-colonial movement in the strict sense of the word, as the land was occupied, and through violence, Hezbollah has reclaimed Lebanese territory, and they've been quite successful at it. They are, at least in the Middle East, by far the most successful group at deterring American hegemony in the region. So, again, just some ABCs about who this group is, what their origins are, and what the context is. Let's talk a little bit about Phenom. Don't have that much to say to you about Phenom. This is not a lecture on who Phenom was. There's plenty of books for that, and I'm sure you're getting lectures on this at your universities, I would imagine. In any case, who's had a Phenom class, just so I know who I'm talking to? You all have had a Phenom class? Yeah? Oh, so maybe not that many people. What did you guys read?
We read Wretched of the Earth.
You read Wretched of the Earth?
Yeah, and we also read Black Skin, White Mask.
The whole thing? You read all of Wretched of the Earth?
Chapters of it. But there was a course on, actually on Phenomenology and Alterity.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, it was really great. We were actually, the way the professor put in the syllabus was like, what does it mean to be, what does alterity mean when you are the position of alterity? Or that you are considered alterative?
Okay.
It's not, so it was actually more on phenomenology, but we ended up with Phenom as well.
Cool.
Yeah.
And who else has read, yeah?
Well, I just read Black Skin, White Mask.
Okay. All of it?
Yeah.
Cool.
Most.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken a couple classes where we've read all of Wretched of the Earth and all of Black Skin, White Mask.
Okay. All right. So some people know a little bit about who this guy is. The part of Phenom's work that I'm interested in talking about today is really the part from the maybe the second phase of his career, right? So if you read Black Skin, White Mask, Black Skin, White Mask is really more focused on his experiences in Martinique, in the West Indies. Now, in 1953, Phenom takes a job in Blida in Algeria. He's a psychiatrist, right? I mean, he works at a hospital. He's not a philosopher at all, like in the classic sense of working at a university. Now, 1953, if you're keeping track of the dates and the context, right? He basically enters Algeria in the middle of a war. Did you guys, like when they teach this, they're teaching this stuff? You talk a little bit about this context?
Yeah.
So, in the essay that you read, Why We Use Violence, I'm sure you picked up on this, but he's defending the techniques of the FLN. The FLN is basically the Algerian militia that is working on throwing the French colonizers out of France. And the FLN needs defending because the FLN decides, like in the mid-50s, it's a good idea strategically for them to kill French civilians in Algeria. So if you've seen the classic movie Battle of Algiers, right? You witness these bombings. In the Battle of Algiers, right, there's that famous scene where 3 women carry bombs in their clothes, go into the French quarter, through the checkpoints into the French quarters, and they blow up a bar. A bomb doesn't go off, but they tried to blow up an airport. And what was the other one? Like a ice cream shop or something like that? I can't remember. Yeah, right, sorry, a cafe. Yeah, and Phenom is saying, look, as you read, you guys are violent. Colonialism is violent. You guys speak the language of violence. That colonized people speak the language of violence back to you should not be a surprise. Now, what I'm interested in, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm interested in is how this North African context is received by Phenom scholars in the United States. Now, I just want to say this, right? Like Hezbollah does not defend the killing of innocent civilians. Okay? It might happen, but they do not, it's not a strategy. They don't actively try to do it. Phenom is more, in this case, and in other senses, Phenom is more extreme than Hezbollah. Now, a lot of Phenom's work, certainly after 1953, a lot of Phenom's work is about anti-Arab racism and French colonialism in Algeria, In fact, at a certain point in his career, Phenom will, in his mind, become Algerian. He'll say, actually, I think he said it in the reading that I assigned to you all, he'll speak in terms of we Algerians, right? He's no longer Martinican, at least in his understanding of himself. But really, you can find this theme of anti-Arab racism running throughout Phenom's work. If you look at an essay like The North African Syndrome, Phenom's talking about how his patients, when he was in Lyon, are characterized as always lying about their illnesses, so they can't honestly speak their pain. An essay like Medicine and Colonialism, Phenom's talking about how Algerian patients don't trust Western medicine because a lot of the time these doctors are also participating in torture and the colonial techniques of the French military. The doctors are actually part of the military. An essay like Ethno-Psychiatric Considerations, right? Where Phenom is debating this characterization of Arab people as like in a vegetative state because their brains haven't developed far enough. He explains why it's actually a strategy on the part of Arab people not to speak or not to tell the truth to their doctors, right? An essay like, that's actually something you also find in an essay like Conduite d'aveu. I can't remember how that got translated, but a short essay called Conduite d'aveu. He's talking about how certain psychiatrists in Algeria believe that Arab people are just incapable of figuring out the difference between truth and falsity. But Phenom is saying, no. When they're lying to you in courts, it's because they're trying to scramble your schematic of truth and falsity. They're trying to scramble your language so that it no longer makes sense. So Phenom is always combating this kind of scientific racism of Arab people, mainly perpetrated by a guy named Antoine Perot. He's always combating that with, roughly speaking, a kind of phenomenological approach to the pathologies and the behaviors that colonialism creates, right? Behavior that seems pathological, but when you look at it in its colonial context, it's actually a reasonable response to certain stimuli. I think you see that context in an essay like Why We Use Violence. Now, as Gabriel was mentioning yesterday, we were talking about how intellectuals are trained to have certain blind spots. Now, it's good to keep this in mind because a lot of times what we see happening, like maybe from our discussion yesterday, the discussion might kind of go like this, right? Like I'm guilty of this. Why are you reading so much Foucault or Derrida? Why don't you read Phenom? You know? And Phenom in a way comes to, in a way Phenom's name comes to be constructed as a kind of a proper name for the legitimate margins of the field. And he comes to fill that role for us. He comes to be the margin, to borrow Spivak's language, he comes to kind of be the margin that the center has to create for itself in order to edify itself. And you would just think, right? I mean, you know, as Foucauldians, we would say, you know, if there is a robust discussion of this thing called Phenom, it's because power has designated it a legitimate object of knowledge. How did that happen? How has this person who advocates for Arab terrorism, Arab Muslim terrorism against French civilians become the kind of really the currency of, you know, marginalized voices today? Now, in my time in this field, I've watched this develop. And in a way, Phenom is an interesting case because as he's entering our field and becoming part of the mainstream now, we can actually see these blind spots develop. And what I want to talk about now just a little bit is what's going on with that. And as you're going to see, as I go through some passages here from Phenom scholars, namely a guy named Lewis Gordon at University of Connecticut, who's basically the really, in a way, responsible for bringing Phenom into philosophical discourse today, and is certainly the foremost Anglophone Phenom scholar in the world today. I'd like to go through some of his works and see how he has prepared Phenom to become popular in professional academic philosophy today, okay? So again, right, as we go through this, the question is, we have a corporate university, as we mentioned yesterday, hand in glove with the military-industrial complex, and we're going to champion this guy who loves Arab terrorism. Now, how it happens is, how Phenom is brought into the philosophical world is, as you might guess, the Arab context of the whole thing is just drained. How does it happen? Well, again, let's look at Gordon. His 1995 book, Phenom, the Crisis of European Man. It's really the first philosophical treatment of Phenom. He deals with Phenom's Arab context and his advocacy of violence in the Arab context simply by reading Phenom and imposing the categories of the American census on 1950 Algeria. And this is what Gordon says in that book. Arabs and North Africans are defined in the racial constructions that dominate the European world as Caucasians. So if you understand what he's trying to say there, in Europe, Gordon is trying to tell his American audience, in Europe, Arabs and North Africans are white. The strategy is to mold Phenom's work to the American black-white binary. And I just have to say, I don't know if it strikes me, but it's just so wildly false for him to say this. It's like out of hand, really. It doesn't just go against so much of Phenom's writings. I mean, you see it in this document, Why We Use Violence. It doesn't just go against so much of Phenom's writings. I mean, really, anybody with a basic understanding of the racial categories and the history of Europe knows that this is false. And David Macy wrote a biography of Phenom and called Gordon out for this. And I think it's a 2003 biography. This is what David Macy says in his Phenom biography. He says, Arabs and North Africans are called many things in French, most of them appallingly insulting, but they are never called Caucasians. And that's true. That's true. So, you know, you might just let it go, right? Hey, it's just one sentence. Why make a big deal of this, John? Stop being so sensitive. Just get on with it. But Gordon comes back and writes another book a couple years ago. And he doubles down. Even though Macy corrected him, he has to double down on it. There's a discussion in that book of Phenom's situation in Algeria, and he's talking about the way that purportedly Phenom was rejected by both his French counterparts in Blida, at the hospital in Blida, and the Arab community, right? Phenom, according to Gordon, was rejected by both communities, and so he had this kind of outsider standpoint where he could somehow see everything. Now, there's no question that Phenom was rejected by the French community. There's no doubt about that. The whole reason he was in Algeria is because nobody in France would hire him. Phenom fought for the French in World War II. He took shrapnel to the chest, and France sent him home back to Martinique. France sent him back to Martinique on a cattle barge. He was supposed to benefit from something like a GI Bill, and France tried to deny it to him. No question that France does not embrace Frantz Fanon. But in Algeria, where Fanon is buried, Fanon insisted that he be buried in Algeria, in spite of the fact, apparently, that the Algerians don't like him. In Algeria, they gave him a martyr's grave. Now, I'm not saying that in Algeria, Fanon is as beloved as the heroes that fought for the FLN, right? He's not on that level, but he's accepted in the Algerian cultural landscape. So, and don't forget, right? Fanon says he's Algerian. Fanon died in Algeria. And Aimé Césaire said this about Fanon. Césaire says, he chose. He became Algerian. He lived, fought, and died Algerian. So it's surprising to me that when Gordon comes back and writes again, talking about Fanon's conditions in the hospitals in Algeria, when Gordon says this, right? Gordon says, many, maybe even most Arabs hated blacks. And as many blacks know today across the continent and in the Middle East, that hatred or sense of superiority continues. Now, okay, right? Certainly anti-black racism in the Arab community. I don't deny it for a minute. It's just that when he writes this and he provides a footnote, you expect Gordon to show you somewhere in Fanon's writings where Fanon said, yeah, wow, these Arabs, real anti-black. You don't find this in the footnote. Gordon goes on in the footnote instead to tell us about the Arabs. Sorry. In the Phenonian tradition, one of the things that Fanon taught us is that one of the techniques of racism and colonialism is to invent the Arab. If you read chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Mask, that's what Fanon's analyzing there. It's actually one reason you might read Lewis Gordon is because that's how you get put in what Fanon would call the zone of non-being, where a single individual black person is recognized as the blacks. And so here's Gordon just taking a long footnote to tell us about who the Arabs are. Here's a passage from the footnote. This is what he tells us, right? The Arabs are anti-black. Gordon writes, quote, for them, the Arabs, all the Arabs everywhere, it was hypocritical for Algerians to seek solidarity with black Africans under the banner of African solidarity when, get me with this, but for becoming a French colony, they would have identified with Europe and the Middle East. Let's just go through this. Gordon says, for them. Who's them? Like all them Arabs? And then he says this, right? It's hypocritical for the Algerians to unite with Phenom, to partner with Phenom. Because, but for becoming a French colony. As if that's a fucking minor detail. But for becoming a French colony. You read Why We Use Violence. What do you mean, but for becoming a French colony? But for the fact that French people rape these women to the point of insanity? But for that, they identify with the Europeans? But for the fact that the French picked up Algerian people, put them in helicopters, and dropped them into the Mediterranean Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea? But for that? But for the fact that they electrocuted them and tortured them? I mean, what is he doing? It's like he just turned his mind off. They would have identified with Europe and the Middle East. First of all, by 1950, the Middle East is not European, right? And then Gordon says this, right? This was the one that really, I didn't actually write this down, but I remembered it, and it's the one that really kills me. I don't know why I didn't write this down. I guess I forgot. He says, look, if you want to learn more about the Arabs, where should you go? In the Phenonian tradition, where should you go if you want to learn more about the Arabs? You're going to go to Orientalism, Said's 1978 book, where he tells you how the Arabs got invented for the purposes of domination and control in the 19th century. That's for a Phenonian, that's where you would go. Edward Said works in Phenom's tradition. Is this what Gordon tells us? Go read Edward Said and learn about how Arabs got invented, how the Middle East got invented by philologists in the 19th century? No, he says, go read these two Scottish Orientalists in Edinburgh. Go read their blog post where they just make sweeping statements about the Arabs. This is his footnote to support this stuff. So anyway, I can't let it go. Sorry. I can't let it go. Doesn't pass. Now, my point is just that a lot of acrobatics have to get turned in order for this guy Phenom to get on your syllabi. This is some of the acrobatics, right? This is just one moment. If we went through more of the literature, we would see more of this stuff happening. I was at a conference just a month ago, and suddenly it was just common sense that Phenom's advocacy of violence was metaphorical. He wasn't actually advocating violence, it's just a metaphor. Read why we use violence. Tell me it's a metaphor, right? He tells you it's that the violence is felt in the blood and in the muscles, right? It's literal violence. The FLN was committing literal violence. It's wild. But my point is just, again, this so-called marginal figure, by the time he even gets to be the marginal figure, and we've even heard of him, he's already been modified and mediated in so many ways. And a proper genealogy, like one of the things you were getting at yesterday, right? A critical approach to knowledge production in the academy just simply asks, how is it possible that this is an object of knowledge? How is it possible that Phenom is an object of knowledge? Right? So many things in a way were already going for Phenom, allowing him to get heard in the academy. It's not by accident that he shows up in these phenomenology classes, right? He read Sartre, he was in Merleau-Ponty's classes, he speaks the language of phenomenology to a certain extent, he speaks French, he's Christian, he fought for the French in World War II, he even started his medical career in Paris, but didn't like Paris because there were too many black people in Paris, as he says in his journals, and went to Lyon. I mean, white people have reason to read this guy, have reasons to like him. When Muslims in Lebanon say the same stuff, it's beyond the pale. It's beyond the pale, right? So that's one thing to think about. What do we recognize as the margins of this field, and how do those margins get constructed by the mainstream sort of core areas, so to speak, of knowledge production? Now, I do want to say this, right? In a way, I kind of have sympathy for Gordon. I kind of like Gordon. Gordon at least writes about the Arabs in his work on Phenom. At least he acknowledges it, even just a sentence, even if it's crazy. I mean, the other people in Phenom, they couldn't spell Arab. They don't care at all about it. They don't put it in their work. It's not part of any of the diversity propaganda that goes around in professional academic philosophy. Now, I mean, I guess the part of it that is frustrating for me as a race theorist in this field is that on the flip side, like where Gordon is so intent on making this distinction between them Arabs and us sub-Saharan Africans, or us black people in the narrow sense of the word, the Trumps of the world, they don't make the distinction, right? When Trump wants to demonize the caravan coming to invade us from Central America, when he wants to demonize the caravan, he puts Middle Easterners right in it, even though there are no Middle Easterners walking here from Honduras. But Trump just puts them in. When this guy Sheriff Clark, you watch, right? You know this guy Sheriff Clark? No? Yes? He's on YouTube. You'll find him. He's the black police officer that they always put on Fox News to justify the police killings of young black men, Sheriff Clark. He's always wearing his Israel pin, every time. He never forgets to wear it. Now the NYPD, right? When NYPD wants to open up a new office, right? The people that strangled Eric Gardner, the people that brought us stop and frisk. When they want to open up a new office, where do they open up a new office? NYPD now has an office in Jerusalem. They don't make the distinction. They know. They know. Those are colonial projects. On the flip side, Angela Davis does not make the distinction. Malcolm X did not make the distinction. Syed Hassan Nasrallah speaks out against anti-black racism in the United States, just like he speaks out against Israeli colonialism in the Middle East. Those guys don't make the distinction. And what Davis taught us, what Angela Davis taught us, even just back in January. Did you all hear about this? With Angela Davis? Yeah, right, heard about what? I haven't told you yet. Angela Davis was supposed to get a Shuttlesworth Award for civil rights down in Alabama, right? And she was, my home state of Alabama. She was denied the award. You know why? Because she had spoken out against Palestine. They said, look, like let's just like not get involved with this. Too much trouble. What Davis teaches us, one of the many things that Davis teaches us, is if you ignore anti-Arab violence in your anti-racist practice, if you ignore anti-Arab violence, you're going to get rewarded. And Gordon is one of the people that reaps these rewards. Philosophy's race charade, as it's currently playing out, reaps these rewards. And it's not even really so much, at the end of the day, a comment about Lewis Gordon. It's more just to say that the race theory we are getting in philosophy today is just the race theory that the corporate university, that the good people of Connecticut and Pennsylvania will allow us to have. And these two places, they're a short train ride from ground zero. That race theory is going to be anti-Arab, and they're going to make stuff up to make it anti-Arab, and that's just what you see Gordon doing. So in any case, that's in a kind of roundabout way what I wanted to say about Phenom. Now, how these two readings come together is like this for me. Let's say you're an Arab scholar in philosophy, and you know your history, right? You know 45,000 dead in Sétif. You know Sabra and Shatila. You study not just the Iraq War, but what we were doing in Iraq in the 1990s, right? Genocide in Iraq in the 1990s. Let's say you want to use your platform and support decolonial programs from your region, right? Let's say for me as a philosopher, as a scholar, I want to support anti-colonial movements from my region. Now, I learned from Phenom that that movement is going to decolonize not just the present moment, but colonialism occupies time, past, present, and future. So I need to find a movement that's going to decolonize time, past, present, and future. You saw this theme in Why We Use Violence. I know that this movement in the Middle East is going to embrace violence when it's necessary. I know that it's going to oppose capitalism, from Phenom, Wretched of the Earth, and really any of Phenom's writings is always opposing capitalism, certainly in chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth. I know that it'll be a nationalist movement, but it's also going to embrace and oppress people all around the world. I know that it's going to be based upon a kind of Manichaean structure of the oppressor and the oppressed. I know it's going to originate with the rural poor. I know that America and Europe are going to demonize the group and label it a terrorist organization. Now, can I embrace such a movement from the Middle East or North Africa and be heard amongst my colleagues in the philosophy of race? I would say no. So we can go more into these comparisons between what Phenom says a decolonial movement is going to look like and how much Hezbollah looks exactly like that in our discussion. But I've been talking now for almost an hour, and I think I'm just gonna wrap it up and let you all ask questions or have your say or yell at me. I'm all for it.
Maybe I could just get things started with one question, and then I'll take stock. I was curious, the category of violence and the way in which it's used, like the category of terrorist, is so commonly used in order to, as a kind of double gesture of sorts, where on the one hand, the structural violence and the terroristic practices of the hegemonic nation states, like the United States, like Israel and others, that form of violence and terrorism is completely naturalized. And the term violence and terrorist is usually then applied to anyone who tries to resist the naturalized violence of the hegemonic forces. And so I wonder at times whether or not that term is even appropriate. Like, there's a great example that Michael Parenti gives of classic openings of kind of Hollywood films from the 40s and 50s, but you still have them today. And then you have a fort in some barren part of the land, and a few white people inside, and a lot of black and brown people who are attacking the fort. And most people, when I watch a movie like that, it's like, wow, those black and brown people are really quite violent. But what Parenti highlights is, no, they're not violent. What's violent is the fort. The fact that the fort is there has naturalized the structural violence of hegemonic colonial rule. And so we have to be clear about identifying, as Martin Luther King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That would be the US government, beyond a doubt. And apply the category of violence and terrorism to the primary source. Because there would not be anti-colonial violence if there was not the violence of colonialism, in short. So I'd be curious to hear you on, it's at once a political but then also a larger philosophic question. Maybe the term violence, because you were saying like, Phenom supports Arab terrorism against French civilians. It seems to me, and you might have been a bit polemical in that, but it seems to me that what he supports is extricating the violence of colonialism by any means necessary.
Well, when I say that, I'm just saying My point in saying that is just to say, if you have what the FLN was doing in the 1950s pop up on CNN today, it's terrorism 8 days a week. So for the sort of polite bourgeois Phenom crowd now, let's just call it what it is. This shows up on CNN, and it's terrorism, and you guys now are going to come out and support it, right? And they want that. That is not what it is. It has to be mediated and in a way manufactured in a way to at the same time distance themselves from that. And that is not the Phenonian spirit. Phenom paid a price for not distancing himself from that.
Yeah.
And we want to say that we're down with Phenom and at the same time distance ourselves from anything. I'm not even asking the Phenonians to pick up, to bear arms. Just
Yeah, hopefully they won't.
just support.
That'd be scary.
Just,
Oh, sorry.
just follow through on the argument that you're making.
Yeah, no, I think the,
You see what I'm
the
saying?
larger point that you made is very important, and that is that there's a domestication and a neutering of radical traditions of thought that's mediated by the US Academy. You see it in Phenonians, you see it in Afro-pessimism, you see it in the construction of decolonial theory and how it bleeds out all of the radical things that are coming from Latin America and elsewhere for that matter.
Right,
So,
right.
no, I think that's a fundamental and very, very important point for identifying how critical thought is actually produced within the academy and then globalized through the power mechanisms of the imperial university.
Right, but to your point, should you use the word terrorism or not? For me, it's totally strategic and it depends on the context.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you see Hezbollah uses the word terrorist still. They don't want to do away with it because they will label Israel and above all the United States as a terrorist organization.
Right.
You know, so there you go.
I think Wayne was going to kick it off, and if you want to just raise your hand and I'll take, okay. Go ahead, Wayne, and I'll note the hands
All
down.
right. So settler colonialism, according to Patrick Wolf, is a structure, not an event.
Mm-hmm.
And Glenn Coutard takes this up in his book Red Skin, White Masks, where he says that settler colonial states are territorially acquisitive in perpetuity. The implication being, at least insofar as we're concerned with Turtle Island, is that the settler states of Canada and the United States at least must be systematically, comprehensively dismantled in total if we are to prevent settler colonialism and settler kleptomania from continuing, right? Would this not entail, based on the parallel you drew previously with the colonization in North America and Israel, the complete systematic dismantlement of the state of Israel at the same time?
Hezbollah's, that is Hezbollah's basic mission, absolutely. That's Hezbollah's basic mission. Hezbollah does not support the state of Israel. They don't even recognize it, the name Israel. It's a Zionist entity.
Right, so then maybe then my follow-up would be to just kind of like bring up those parallels, because I'm on the same page, obviously, but I'm curious as to whether or not there are certain disjuncts or homonyms that we can draw between these two cases, because obviously the history of settler colonialism in Turtle Island is different than in Israel, or maybe it's not, I don't know. What can you say to that parallax?
I would say this. It's interesting. I actually have kind of a long answer to give you, and I might just give you the long answer because I find it really interesting. One of the things, I might need some notes for this. Sorry. One of the things that Hezbollah is trying to do is kind of like a nexus for Hezbollah between that includes the occupation of time, the occupation of their land, and the use of violence. Those three things for Hezbollah all go hand in hand. And I'm drawing here on a friend of mine, Bashir Sadeh's work. He wrote a book called Hezbollah and the Politics of Remembrance. And Bashir explained this to me in a way that was really like you should have got him to come here. That's what I'm saying. But anyway, sorry. Now, Hezbollah is real aware of this analogy between what the United States did with Native Americans and what Israel's trying to do with land in the Middle East. In effect, this Fallow Lands Act basically just saying, look, nobody's here, we're just going to take it. So you got to create a narrative where there's nobody there. So Hezbollah has a kind of like, to to me, kind of brilliant response to this. You find it in their speeches, you find it in their weekly newspaper, Al-Ahd. You find it really all over southern Lebanon, where they're always commemorating the martyrs, right? Boy, this becomes a real long answer. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm just going to leave it at that, okay? Martyrdom is like a pillar of Shia Islam. We'll just leave it at that. And we look up Imam Hussein in Karbala. But in any case, now, what Hezbollah does, right, with their martyrs, they commemorate them like all the time. So say you die in a battle, right? Your death is going to be memorialized 1 week after the fact, 1 month after the fact, and 1 year after the fact. And I don't mean like in a small way, like they're going to write a remembrance of you at each anniversary. Now in these wars with Israel, a lot of people have died. So there's like a remembrance of these deaths every day. And there's a saying that you find really in a lot of Hezbollah's writings, every day is Ashura, right? Every day is Ashura. Now, that is a way for them of creating a kind of history of the resistance, right? To kind of create a past that is their own, but also it's almost kind of like an ethical promise as to how you're supposed to live your life. You're supposed to live your life willing to die for the resistance. But it's not just about creating a kind of time continuum for themselves, right? Remember, you read it in the manifesto. One of the things that the quote-unquote war on terror wants to do is to eliminate people or strip people of their historical roles, right? Take people out of time. And so Hezbollah, through their martyrology, creates this kind of memorialization, or memory, I should say, memory of the violence, so that they have a kind of history of the resistance that is always being replayed. Every day is being replayed in their media, in their literature. Now, that idea about decolonizing time is also connected to the land. Because remember, this movement starts in southern Lebanon. Southern Lebanon is, in the early 80s, really neglected by the Lebanese state. They have not surveyed it. They don't really know what's down there. The government in Beirut, right? Beirut is more like central north in Lebanon. And there's quite a lot of land in the south that really hasn't been accounted for, like in the literal sense of like hasn't been counted, like it hasn't been statisticized, you might say, right? And so what Hezbollah does in their literature is they archive not just who died, not just when they died, but they also document where the person died. And in this literature, they create quite a body of literature. There's actually a lot of literature coming out now on Hezbollah because they have written so much, and you can, like in a country like Lebanon, you can just kind of get access to it, where other Middle Eastern countries you don't quite get access to these things so easily. But in any case, so what they're doing with this is, sorry, this is such a roundabout answer, but I find this I struggle to get my mind around this, but I find it so interesting. What they're doing through the violence, right? So there's the act of violence. There's the martyrdom. Then there is the archiving of the violence, the memory of the violence. But in the archiving of the violence, there's a documentation of where the violence happened. So this violence happened in Jazin. This violence happened in Bekaa. This violence happened in Sidon. So that there's a written history of Hezbollah's presence on the land. And not just that they've been there, but that the land has always been marked by the resistance. Hezbollah calls themselves the resistance. And they're not just documenting acts of violence or people that died fighting Zionists. They document intensely. They're like obsessed with the details of these events. Who died? What was the person's name? What were their conditions? What was the purpose of the act? They're documenting who died fighting the French on that land, who died fighting the Ottoman Empire on that land. So they're trying to create for themselves not just any history, but a documented archival history of their presence on the land, so that it becomes very hard to come into southern Lebanon and say, oh, look, nobody lives here, nobody's been here. Hezbollah can come and say, oh, look, we have all these documents. This person died, this person died, this person died defending the land, going back all the way to the 19th century. It's a way for them creating a history and territory of the resistance through the violence. Do you see what I'm saying? And what's interesting is to that, for me, what's interesting about that, a number of things are interesting, but Phenom would tell us, what does violence do? It decolonizes time, and above all, it decolonizes the land. And this is Hezbollah's strategy to a T. They're trying to do this. Maybe not in the way Phenom thought about it, but that's just to say, a long-winded way of saying, Hezbollah has studied, and Israel has studied, what the United States did and what Canada has done in North America, and Hezbollah is trying to think through it and thwart it through these different kinds of techniques. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway, of course, is that what's peculiar is that it's the creation of an archive, which seems to be, a shadow archive rather, which seems to be the main conduit of territorializing or indigenizing the territory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, what I think is curious, is the creation of that shadow archive.
What do you mean by a shadow archive?
Well, you said archive yourself.
Right? Yeah, that's
so I'm
that's
just
the
like
word.
borrowing Alice Kula's term as like an alternate archive. As
I hear you.
So that's
That's I hadn't heard that. So in any case, that's what I find kind of brilliant about it. For me, reading Hezbollah helps me understand Phenom's work better, because, I mean, in a way, Phenom's not fighting for the FLN. Phenom's like a great poet sometimes, and it's like, all right, you're going to decolonize the land. How? You're going to decolonize time. How? You know, when I read Hezbollah, it's like, oh, this might be what that looks like. But of course, as soon as I read Hezbollah, I'm like out of bounds. So,
I think Spencer is up next. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for this. This is fascinating. And my question is about Hezbollah's political manifesto. And I wonder, I mean, it's very clear with how you talk about Phenom, of like how he is defanged in certain ways and read in certain ways to be able to become palatable to the academy. Whereas you say that Hezbollah isn't. But I was wondering, I mean, when I read the manifesto, and this is coming from a position of ignorance on Hezbollah, but you've convinced me that I need to do research into it. It seems to me that, I mean, it struck me as like very like liberal and like secular and social democratic in terms of their political program, in terms of how they view the state, in terms of how they view themselves as a political party. They don't even say that they're socialist or anti-capitalist, they see brutal capitalism. You know, so for me, I'm like, it would be so easy for somebody to read the manifesto and just be like, oh yeah, this is very easy to like bring.
yeah, that's what I think.
But then so I'm like, well, am I missing something completely? Am I missing something about Hezbollah's politics, or how they portray themselves in the manifesto, if they're trying to speak to a specific audience? And So given that, I mean, why don't you think that Hezbollah has been able to be brought into the academy when it seems on the face of the manifesto that it would be easy to?
I mean, I have my suspicions, you know. I think that the race theory that we have in the academy is the race theory that the American universities are okay with. I think that sounds conspiratorial, though. But
I don't.
I mean, I'm just saying,
Well,
you know,
just-
I know
Well,
you
look at
don't.
the-
Of course you.
Yeah, well, I'm a conspiracy theorist, so I'm good to go. I mean, look at the way in which the black radical tradition, they killed them, they put them in prisons, they didn't give them jobs, and there's a great body of literature on the rise of American study, or African American studies, and where it came from. There were liberal organizations that were funded and trained by the CIA. So I don't think it's at all surprising, from a conspiratorial point of view at least.
Yeah, I really think that. I'd say I think we get the Arab philosophy that the Orientalists made for us. People like Kant or Hegel never doubted that at one point their quote-unquote Hindu race, of which the Arabs were a part, at one point did something kind of philosophical. I mean, Kant is like a raving white supremacist. Sorry, Kantians, but it's a fact. You know, he never doubts that, you know, Arabs and Chinese and Indians did something kind of philosophical. Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history, something kind of seemed to have happened with these people. But like the Africans definitely didn't do anything philosophical. The indigenous Americans definitely never did anything philosophical. And when you look at your curriculum, what do you have? One Chinese philosophy class, no African philosophy classes, no North American philosophy classes. I mean, that's exactly what the Orientalists created for us. So the Arab philosophy that we have is the Arab philosophy that got designated in the late 18th, early 19th century. The idea that there is, like, forget Hezbollah, the idea that there is such a thing as contemporary Arab thought is not, it's an oxymoron. Contemporary Arab thought is not a thing. Per Kant or Hegel, Arabs stopped thinking a long time ago. And I mean, Hezbollah does not come out of the blue. In the 19th century, as colonialism invents the Arab category, the Arab Renaissance is happening at the same time. People like Boutros al-Bustani or al-Afghani are creating an anti-colonial Arab discourse in the 19th century. But to say that you do Arab philosophy today, it means you study Al-Kindi, it means that you study medieval Islamic philosophy. There is no such thing as contemporary Islamic thought. So it's not just Hezbollah, it's like across the board. Does that, I mean, plus the conspiracy.
I think Gustavo is up next.
Yes. Thanks. I really like the presentation. I study Freire and Boal, and they both read Phenom a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I see. I have a question because in the passage you asked us to read, I didn't print it. There's a passage in which Phenom writes that the colonized, when he faces the colonial discourse, he mocks them.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Wretched of the Earth also there's a passage, and I will read. Phenom writes, "The colonized subject is constantly on his guard, but deep down the colonized subject acknowledges no authority. He is dominated but not domesticated. He is made to feel inferior, but by no means convinced of his inferiority." I don't know, this is a big difference between Phenom and Freire and Boal, because Freire and Boal would say that the colonized actually buy into the discourse that they are inferior. And this is a problem for emancipation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, my question is, does Phenom, because in the Wretched of the Earth also, and in the I know I had the impression, so I'm not a Phenom scholar, so I might be wrong, that Phenom thinks that there is something like a deep self, a deep ego, that in the liberation process will be, that somehow manages to remain intact as it is exposed to oppressive discourses, and that the goal, the process of liberation should be simply to reach this inner self, and that's it, and then you get liberation. I don't know, I think Freire and Boal's perspective for me is, I don't know, less naive or more interesting, because they think that there's no such, there's no uncontaminated part of the self. So when oppressive groups are exposed to oppressive discourses, the whole self is infected, so to speak. And the process of liberation is precisely to recompose the self entirely. And also another question is, so this is my first question, does he give an account, am I misreading Phenom? And also, does he has, also when I read the piece you asked us to read, I had the impression that Phenom believes that once liberation is reached, that's it. We all free, we all, like, there's this idea of the homogeneous people that are all brothers and sisters, and I don't know, I mean, other theorists of oppression would say, like, Freire and Boal would say, no, oppression is endless. So the struggle against oppression is never ending. Boal has a really good case study with Gotha, was a group of poor Afro-Brazilian gay men who used his techniques in order to fight against oppression. And he showed out that even after they became conscious of the oppressive discourses, they started to reproduce oppression amongst themselves. So, I don't know, I asked a lot of things. And just an observation for Gabriel. Freire doesn't, the concept of violence, this is a caveat that Freire adds to Phenom. He believes that when the oppressed is reacting to the oppressor, he's not being he or she is not being violent. So we shouldn't call violence the act, because it's only a reaction to a previous oppression, right?
Right. Oh, okay, so a couple things. From Wretched of the Earth, in a way Wretched of the Earth is optimistic. Although if you read it all the way through to chapter 5, it's kind of not that optimistic. So, on the one hand, I would say this: if you're really interested in this question of the end of oppression and does violence accomplish that, this guy named David Marriott wrote a great book. David what? Marriott, like Marriott Hotels. I'm sure he'll hate me for saying that, but sorry. I don't know, but that's how you spell it. The idea in chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth is that, like, colonialism holds the colonized in this kind of petrified state, right? If you read chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth, there's always this idea of petrification. Marriott talks about this really, really brilliantly. And the idea is that violence is going to be detoxifying, that violence is going to be depetrifying in a way, right? And in a way, it is like really optimistic, right? And then suddenly oppressed peoples are going to enter the world history, they're going to throw out the colonizers, they're going to occupy their land. But if you read through to the end of Wretched of the Earth, it doesn't quite work that way. Chapter 5 of Wretched of the Earth is like all of Phenom's patients who committed this violence and acted in this war are, as you would imagine, traumatized. And it doesn't quite look so liberating. So that's one thing to say about it. The other thing to say about it is, you know, when you look at how race theory has developed since from Phenom, right? Certainly like 80s post-colonial thought, took a lot from Phenom with all of its discussions of the politics of representation. People like to say it in Spivak. But another probably less recognized tradition that owes something to Phenom is the critical race tradition in the United States, the legal tradition in the United States, critical race theory, as it was articulated by people like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Shao Harris. They're not that optimistic coming out of Phenom. Bell especially, not Derek Bell, not especially optimistic coming out of Frantz Fanon. And the reason is, when you look at Fanon's, actually it reminds me how much I like these authors. When you look at Fanon's recommendation for decolonial violence, again, he's in Algeria. And Algerian violence is getting help from Tunisia, they're getting help from other Arab countries in the region. In 1970, a woman named Francie Covington writes a short essay, and it's in Tony Cade's anthology, the Black Woman in Anthology. She writes this short essay. Francie Covington writes this short essay. It's titled something like, "Do the revolutionary practices in the Battle of Algiers apply to Harlem?" I can't remember the title of it. Something like that. And Covington basically says, look, no, it doesn't apply. We can't do this, guys. Like, it might have worked for them, and I don't think it really worked for them all that well if you look at Algeria today. But in any case, it might have worked over there, but what Fanon is talking about just doesn't apply to us, black people in America over here. We don't have the resources, we don't have the regional support, we're isolated. This detoxifying violence, this decolonial violence is just not an option for us. And so what comes out of that? By the 1980s, you have Derek Bell saying, look guys, if we're not going to commit this Fanonian violence, then racism in America is permanent. And that is like a pillar of critical race theory. Racism in America is permanent. It's a pillar of that legal tradition. America is a racist country, and if we can't destroy America with violence, then it's racism from here on out. And you can certainly see similarities to that in the Afro-pessimist tradition that's very popular now. In any case, that's one thing to say. The other thing I would just say very briefly, as you read more of Phenom, I can't remember exactly how you asked this, but I for some reason thought at one point I have to say this. But you're going to find in Phenom's work like a lot of analyses of self-hatred. It's like if you read Black Skin, White Mask, certainly the early chapters of Black Skin, White Mask are going through all the dynamics of self-hatred. Not just hatred like we talked with Gordon, right? This hatred between groups. I mean, in a way, it's funny that Gordon says that because colonialism will always create this hatred between groups. It's how it works. It's going to create hatred within groups, and it's going to create hatred within a person's self. That's like what the main thing that Phenom taught us that Gordon somehow forgets. But in any case.
Just the name of the essay, you said David Marriott. Is it a book?
It's a book. It's called Wither Phenom. Yeah. Wither, like W-H-I-T-H-E-R. Wither.
I think there's just one question in the back, and then Alejo. Did you have your hand up before?
Yeah.
No? Yeah, I thought you did, yeah.
I thank you for your presentation. I think it was really, like provoking so many thoughts, I guess. But I don't have any question, but more objections to reappropriation of Phenonian thought to Hezbollah. And I'm curious about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I have so many things to say, but trying to summarize them in one single point. I think this kind of like application of anti-colonial Phenonian thought to Hezbollah is sounds to me more ideological and for many reasons problematic, because you are actually diminishing the fact that Hezbollah is a sort of appendix to imperial powers of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And to that extent, I think that when we are talking about Phenom, there is no doubt in the room, I guess, that the violence, whether we call it violence, is legitimate. Just not, I mean, it doesn't need to be legitimized at all because there is this like self-propagating logic of legitimization on the brute fact of like being colonized, and this comes from the dichotomy of colonized and colonizer, as you know better than me.
Mm-hmm.
So, but like the same occasion we might think of is now the case in Gaza, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I mean, every Palestinian in Gaza is in apartheid situation, even in their room. So
Mm-hmm.
and there is no doubt about that. In the manifesto, in the very first paragraphs, we read that. So there is this like two paths of opposition. One path of resistance,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the other paths of like U.S. Israeli forces, and I just like read it, and all the direct and indirect, and in various dimensions, alliances, and direct and as well indirect extensions. And what are these, like the criteria for this extendability? I'm telling you, this is just like everyday situation, maybe in southern Lebanon, and I'm sure in Iran, that anything in the name of being against resistance can be brutally oppressed. And so we talked a lot about intersectionality. I think, and you named Angela Davis. I'm quite baffled how we can just put the name of Hassan Nasrallah like just beside Angela Davis. I think, so like for example, another situation is that Hezbollah is against sectarianism in the Lebanese democracy. And they are actually the de facto sectarian ruler in a situation that is very much similar to Berlin 1948 to 1961, before the building of the wall. And so, and the manifesto to me sounds like just a propagandistic expression of Iranian foreign policy interest after the coming to the power of George W. Bush's administration, and legitimate occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I have so many other things to say, but I was just curious whether you thought about this like imperialistic gesture of Hezbollah. And one last thing, I think this application of phenomenon thought and Hezbollah is ahistorical as well, because we need to go through a genealogy of how Hezbollah actually unified all the actual and potential ways and forces against Israel, or like the colonial and militaristic sentiments and intentions of Israel after Islamic Revolution of Iran. So and now they are just like putting everything on under their own name, and I think like their intentions are highly shaky.
I really appreciate this question. I really like this. A few things, actually. I have a question for you. I'm actually interested in hearing more what you think about this. So I have something to say, and then hopefully we have time. First of all, I didn't mean to give the impression that I was just sort of saying that what Phenom said and what Hezbollah are doing are like one and the same thing. There are real differences. But for me, it's more a matter of trying to understand where we might see Phenom's work going in the world today. But I think you're right to say that it's acontextual in the sense that Hezbollah never cites Phenom and doesn't really need him. They work more through the work of an imam named Fadlallah, Shia imam. So it's not trying to be contextual in that sense, though. I'm not trying to be contextual in that sense, though. I know that Hezbollah did not read Phenom, although Fadlallah read Phenom. But in any case, for me, it's just a question of how has this thought developed and what direction has it moved? Because I don't think you're going to see it in the United States. I don't know what these American scholars are talking about or why Phenom appeals to them in the American context. Nobody reads Francie Covington's article, and certainly nobody responds to it in their work, at least not that I see in these debates today. So that's one point, and I really am interested in how you would respond to that. So that's one thing I just would say in response. Secondly, I'm not so, I suppose we could just debate this endlessly, but I don't see Hezbollah as simply as a proxy for Iranian foreign policy. I just don't see them that way. I know that this is or at least I see this as a common way to delegitimate Hezbollah as an independent movement. I don't think it's odd at all that a successful movement in Lebanon would get help from somewhere else. The FLN also certainly got help from their regional neighbors. So I never really get that criticism of Hezbollah. Yeah, Khomeini and Iran generally supports them. If they didn't have that support, they would not do it on their own. Where are they supposed to get anything from? So I don't quite get that part of it, and I don't quite get what's the problem with juxtaposing Angela Davis and Hassan Nasrallah.
Commitments, practical commitments, I guess. Like the same problem with Iran. I don't want to go to it like a dual confrontation. Maybe we can cut after the class.
Sure.
Just one single thing. I mean, there's no sure that whatever is like labeled as terrorism in CNN, you name it, is like, of course, fabricated and sort of like, excluding certain forms of resistance, but doesn't mean that whatever narrative that is just against what CNN shows is legitimate per se. I mean, we need to think of like criteria. That's what I ask you. What are your criteria of extendability, like these kind of like extensions of the forces against resistance? And one single fact from Islamic propaganda. The Iranian state TV has been one of the, I guess, biggest advertisers of Gilets jaunes from the very first Saturday. In the meantime, literally, when the workers were actually brutally oppressed, workers who had so radical, demands of just ruling the factories themselves in Khuzestan, the sort of where Iranian Arabs reside mostly. And then Iranian state TV called it anti-capitalistic when they themselves, and I mean by them, I mean the Revolutionary Guard, who are the most, one of the biggest supporter of Hezbollah, they are the proponents of neoliberal, economic policies. And in many occasions, Hezbollah members were basically utilized to just like oppress people in the streets of Tehran, and then how we can just like put them.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by commitment.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer this succinctly. I would say this, but I'd like to talk to you afterward.
Sure.
One of the things that is appealing about Hezbollah's political approach in the region is, in fact, precisely that they are willing to go along with things that they don't agree with. Like, they were quick to forgive Lebanese Christians for the things that Al-Kateb party did in Lebanon. They defend Assad in Syria. They don't like that many things about these groups, or they don't like everything about these groups. But what they see themselves up against is an American foreign policy that aims to create chaos. And they want, like Naim Qassem in his book, Hezbollah, The Story from Within. If you look in this book, Qassem's book, Qassem says, look, any government, any form of organization is better than chaos. And the United States and Israel's policy in our region is to create chaos. And this is what they did in Iraq. And we need to avoid that at any cost, even if that means that we side with governments that we don't really like, policies that we don't really like. That's a short response to that. So Hezbollah is willing to give up a lot for the basic structure of government in the region. But we should talk more afterwards. Okay? Yeah.
Alejo?
I had sort of two related comments, which is sort of related to the way in which some of the comments that were also made, some of the comments you made and people made. The first is if you can sort of, so you kind of claimed this phrase, right, phenomenon of son of non-being, which is from Black Skin White Mask, I believe. Mm-hmm. Which is what's often taken up by the Afro-pessimists to kind of talk about the specificity of anti-blackness in the United States. My question is, can you know, so most of your reading, you know, against Lewis Gordon was based on the Director of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And so I'd be curious to hear you talk about how is it then that you read Black Skin White Masks, and sort of if you could say a little bit more about your take on Afro-pessimism. So for instance, Lewis Gordon sometimes seem to have unwillingly have in a way started. I mean, the question of Afro-pessimism, of course, has been taken out quite differently by Frank Wilson and others. So I'd be curious, I mean, you also mentioned David Marriott, who sometimes is bunched into this view. So I'd be curious to hear more about how you read Afro-pessimism, you know, who you're thinking about, and what's at stake there with the sort of the exclusion or the evacuation of the Arab in Phenom, and what genealogies you trace there. So that's one sort of related question, and the other one is kind of related to the previous comment too. You know, in Latin America too, I mean, the question is more related to how you think about colonialism today, right? So you sort of talked about the decolonization of time, decolonization of the land, or taking back the land. And I think it's, you know, colonialism as such, or the anti-colonial struggle, or anti-colonialism as a name, is also mobilized in Latin America in quite problematic ways. You know, we mentioned just recently about Iran, for instance, and the revolution occurred in Iran. You know, movements in Argentina, for instance, that mobilize kind of nationalist rhetoric, you know, while always inhabiting the contradiction of capitalism, but also repressing workers in the Northeast. So I'd be curious if you could, because often I'm saying this because in the U.S. often there's a very there's a dichotomy that's made, right? It's like you're either anti-colonial or you're colonialist, right? You know, this happens also when thinking about Rojava, for instance, right? You either support Assad or you can't support the Kurdish liberation struggle. You know, you either support Assad or you support the imperialists. You know, and so, I'm curious about how it is that you're thinking about colonialism as well, because it's a contested term, right? And sometimes those lines are drawn in a way that are also problematic in a way. And so, if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, first with well, maybe maybe I'll talk about the second question first. I mean, kind of to the previous question, I mean, it's hard as a Lebanese person to imagine that there is such a thing as Lebanon in 2019 without Hezbollah, because the Lebanese government is so weak. So it's hard not to concede that. Do you see what I'm saying? And so, and what I mean by that, I mean the way that I understand colonialism is this occupation of the land. I mean, the occupation of land is certainly aided by an occupation of time, but at the end of the day, it comes down to occupying the land. The Israeli invasion in the 80s was after water. So, everything after that, like Lebanon has problems with Syria. But Syria opposes Israeli occupation of Palestine, and Syria opposes Israel's continued land occupation in the region. So at the end of the day, they're kind of on the same basic page. Like, are there going to be these countries, or are there going to be these places or not? Obviously, the thing that's kind of funny in all this is that everybody's defending these countries that France and Britain invented in the first place, which are in some ways totally arbitrary and not productive. But that's a different point. So, for me, I have lots of criticisms of Hezbollah. I don't think at the end of the day it's great for Lebanon to have this kind of extra governmental militia. I don't think it helps the long-term stability of the nation state. But it's also hard to see how the last 20 years might have gone in Lebanon. I mean, Israel wanted to create a Christian Lebanon, like an ethno-state, Christian counterpart in Lebanon. Still does, perhaps. The Lebanon that we have today is in some ways a product of the resistance, in part. And so it's hard not to defend them in a basic way. Do you know what I'm saying? To the second point, to the first question you had on Afro-pessimism, I mean, most of what I've learned about racism has come from black authors, African American, West Indian authors. It's frustrating, like when Frank Wilderson gives an interview and just says, "Fuck the Palestinians. They're never going to help us anyway, so why should we help them?" I find that unproductive. I find that it's not all that radical to say a thing like that in the American Academy. So, Afro-pessimism is a diverse movement. I mean, Christina Sharp is not David Marriott. David Marriott's not, any number of other thinkers involved in this stuff. But, I can't remember exactly what your question was about this.
The question was more related to the Black Skin White Mask. How would you read Black Skin White Mask? If the claim is more, like Lewis Gordon sort of evacuates the Arab,
right?
That's related to Wretch of the Earth. There's maybe another reading.
Yeah, right. Right. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I mean, my point really is, you can go back through Lewis Gordon's. Go back and I'll help you find those passages. You can just delete them from the page, and nothing's lost. So I mean, you can read Black Skin White Mask and not impose on it an Arab narrative. You can read Wretched of the Earth and not extract the Arab context from it. People who do this, these are great books I would really recommend. Marriott's book doesn't do this. Marriott writes a great book, and he cites all the essays that are about anti-Arab racism, and then he just says, look, black people, we have something to learn from this. What's her name? There's too many names. Who's the person who wrote the book, Frantz Fanon, Conflicts and Feminisms, at Vanderbilt? She's awesome. I can't believe I can't remember her name. I'm so bad. Anyway, the book, Frantz Fanon, Conflicts and Feminisms, Tracy Sharpley Whiting, my God. Tracy Sharpley Whiting's book studies Phenom, black skin, white mass, and does not feel the need to marginalize Arab people or Latin American people in the context of it. Gordon wants to define Phenom in terms of a very narrow understanding of blackness. I would say because it allows him to define the field of race theory in a way that's very narrow. And that's one of the problems with our field in philosophy, that really the entire brown world is left to fight over one small position in race theory, one small job or one journal or one book series. Gordon really exemplifies a scarcity mindset when he employs these tactics. The other Afro-pessimists, Wilderson excluded, they don't do this. And you can read them and learn a lot from them. So, yeah.
I think we're almost at the end of our time, so maybe we should wrap up here, particularly just because there's 3 or 4 minutes that I want to keep everybody in the room, just to make sure everybody knows what's going on for the rest of the week. So why don't you please join me in thanking John for